Good afternoon, everyone. Carousel Technology would like to welcome you to our AWS and TrueZero Tech webinar. At this time, I'd like to introduce our speakers for today, Jonathan Cooper and Mike Fluharty from TrueZero Technologies. Jonathan, the floor is all yours.
All right. Gotta get confirmation from the panelists. You guys can see this okay?
Yep, good to go.
Yes.
Okay. Awesome. So first and foremost, just wanted to thank everybody for registering and taking time out to join us here today to talk about securing state cloud journeys. We have a lot of information to get through. I would say that this presentation is really targeted towards speaking about the approaches to tackling, cloud adoption, cloud migrations, and it's meant to be fairly tool agnostic. So we're going to talk a lot about capabilities and the frameworks and some of the approaches that we bring to market. In terms of the agenda, we'll go through some quick introductions to kind of cover down on myself, on the other presenters, as well as our company background. We're going to talk a few minutes about state cloud mission objectives based on our experience working with the clients across the various states that we support. Then we're going to move into some foundational elements in terms of our cybersecurity approach, just to kind of ground the discussion in terms of what are the things you need to have in place up front. And then we'll move into basically the meat and potatoes of this, which is around the secure cloud approach. And then we're going to wrap up with an example customer story of kind of how this works in practice. And then we'll end with some Q&A. So in terms of who we are and where we come from, so again, I'm Jonathan Cooper. I'm the Chief Technology Officer and one of the managing partners here at TrueZero Technologies. I've been with TrueZero for going on about 8 years now, and collectively, I have over 2 decades of experience covering down across many different disciplines, from systems engineering, security architecture, enterprise automation, and a big emphasis on data analytics, SIEM and SOAR, and kind of doing security enablement work with various agencies, which supported across federal, state and local, and commercial as well. And so with that, I'll toss it over to Mike.
And I'm Mike Fluharty. I'm the president of TrueZero Technologies. I've been here about 4 years, and really, as a group and as a company, we focus down on the emerging technology market as well as cyber and cyber resilience within different ecosystems. By trade, I'm a CISO. So I was the CISO for the 2020 census, which was the largest non-military operation in U.S. history. And so a lot of the lessons learned that came out of that have really push forward what we've done in terms of what we're going to show you today, as well as what we're doing as a company and kind of that emerging technology leader. John, back to you.
Cool. Thanks, Mike. So a little bit about us. So TrueZero Technologies, again, we've been around for about 8 years as well. We are a veteran-owned small business, and we focus exclusively on cybersecurity services and what we call cyber adjacent services. So essentially, that's the overlap between IT operations and cybersecurity. So things like endpoint management, software deployment, vulnerability management, things like that. But we've listed out a lot of our core services here, which really span a large depth and breadth of disciplines from cloud security infrastructure through managed services, DevSecOps, so on and so forth. We're really proud of the ethos and kind of the underpinnings of the company. I think we've received a lot of industry recognition in terms of cybersecurity excellence awards over the years. We've placed multiple years in a row on the Inc. 5000 in terms of fastest growing cybersecurity services companies, and ranked as well as some of the the other categories that kind of fall into the Inc. 5000. We've also been in Inc. Best Places to Work workplaces for the past, I think, almost 4 years in a row now. And really, that's just kind of a testament to our commitment to the resources and the individuals that we bring into the company in terms of capabilities and their skill sets, and making sure that we're constantly recognizing and supporting them, with their day-to-day jobs. And then, as far as our approach, which is going to be a common theme throughout this, really the ethos of the company is to adopt a targeted threat actor focused approach to everything that we do. And really that goes back to understanding our customers' mission, their business context, and understanding the types of threats that are going to be, a higher chance of being successful and how to defend against those. So you'll kind of see that common thread as we kind of go through our presentation today. So as far as state and local, and kind of where we're at as of today, so we're actively delivering services in over 25 plus states throughout the continental U.S. We have hundreds of thousands of cloud endpoints under management, and we also provide a bespoke managed service model tied to different capabilities and technologies. And so we've worked with everything from small, medium, and large organizations, as well as kind of driving as a strategic delivery partner whole of state cybersecurity initiatives, which we found to be very successful in terms of breaking down the silos between agencies, and kind of bringing together a blueprint and a repeatable process that allows agencies within a state to adopt a similar framework, and kind of share and integrate information and data. And again, based on all of this experience, we worked with pretty much every state level vertical that you can think of in terms of law enforcement, healthcare, education, so on and so forth. So we have a deep understanding in terms of the regulatory requirements, whether it's a law enforcement firm dealing with CJIS data, or whether it's a higher education, university that has to deal with student, loan information or PII, things like that. And again, we're going to get into more of the specifics there in terms of, how you operate, integrate, and orchestrate cloud environments to support those. All right. And now, so we wanted to touch on our understanding of the state level mission objectives. So again, these can be specific to the organization, but what we found is that these boil down to these basically high level objectives, right? So first and foremost is the ability to deliver reliable and accessible services to citizens and constituents. I think the demand for IT services that are both secure and easily accessible continues to grow year over year. And with that, you're going to be interacting with individuals who need to submit sensitive information, whether it's financial or health data, and that information needs to be protected, right? So not only their ability to connect to the environment, but how their information is processed, how it's tracked, how it's categorized, is of top of mind in terms of mission objectives. Continuity of operations. So again, outages happen. How do we work to reduce that risk, and be able to restore services quickly without causing additional downstream impacts? There's also statutory, regulatory, and audit requirements. So again, depending on your business, depending on the requirements that may be imposed upon you from data requirements to the different cybersecurity frameworks that have to be met, those things have to continuously be evaluated. It's not something that you do once, when you're building, or once a year when an audit comes up. It's something that, and we're going to talk about some of those core focus areas in terms of cloud and how it can help you build out a continuous approach to meeting these. Additionally, tight budget constraints are always a concern. So that really is, again, why we've tailored this to be more tool agnostic. Our goal is to kind of meet you where you are in terms of your journey and in terms of your requirements. So taking it into consideration when we're building out, the governance framework, the operating model, what types of technology meet the requirements and also can meet those budget constraints. And then towards the end here, supporting policy priorities and executive mandates. So we do a lot of work with the federal government as well. So things like executive orders that sometimes have a downstream adoption effect. So things like OMB M2131 in terms of log collection. A lot of states will adopt those. But then there's also the state level executive mandates that have to be taken into consideration. And really all of this bundles up into maintaining public trust and confidence, right? So for the services that you're providing to the citizens of your state, we need to be ahead of threats and ahead of vulnerabilities, and in terms of how we operate these environments. So that way we're not exposing them, and we're not losing that public trust and confidence. So based on those mission objectives and through the work that we've done over the years, it does bubble up some of the, the state level challenges that make it difficult to achieve those missions. So one I'd already mentioned, which is the growing demand for secure digital citizen services and the statewide modernization, right? So if you have legacy infrastructure or on-prem data centers and technology continues to evolve very, very rapidly, you need the ability to spin up things very quickly in a safe and controlled manner. So that becomes one of the primary challenges. Secondarily, fragmented cloud and security strategies across agencies. This is where the whole estate approach really, I think, comes to bear to kind of help solve those issues. But again, if you have silos of approaches and strategies across agencies, it can make it very difficult, especially when you're talking about, like I mentioned here, the hybrid on-prem or poly-cloud architectures, and how do you approach the management and operation in those environments. The difficulty balancing compliance, resilience, and agility, again, goes back to the continuity of operations. How do we build resilient architecture that is both secure and has rapid failover capabilities? And then limited cloud security skills and resource constraints. I think with the advent of remote work, it's allowed for more organizations to be able to tap into better quality and higher skilled labor, because again, skilled labor is not geographically dependent, right? So being able to identify those resources and bring them into the fold is really, really important. But traditionally, it's been difficult to find those capabilities. And lastly, just adopting cloud and utilizing cloud does not mean secure, right? It has to be architected. It has to be planned out in terms of how you're standing up the architecture and the solutions and the applications. And we're going to get into a lot of those core frameworks here in a minute of how we solve that. So why does all that matter? So again, for secure cloud adoption, it really does require, it goes back to that threat actor focused and identity first approach, right? So we're moving away from the legacy, castle and moat and perimeter security, and we're really moving that security edge down to both the user's identity, their device, how they are authenticating and being authorized within the environment, and doing that in a continual fashion to ensure we're staying ahead of those threats. So why cloud? I may be speaking to the choir here a bit, but with the acceleration of new technology, cloud really does, it's almost becoming mandatory in terms of meeting those mission objectives and overcoming these challenges. So it does provide a lot of capabilities. And if you've ever been in the AWS console and just pulled up all of the different services, there's well over 150 to 200 individual distinct services that can be utilized, and so that helps meet that mission. But then it really comes back to kind of like that old adage of security and usability, right? You kind of have to find that balance. And I feel like over the past decade, with cloud, the usability has skyrocketed, and now security is really trying to play catch up, right? And again, I think there's been a lot of advantages and forward momentum in terms of how to secure these environments and still take advantage of all the additional technology and capabilities that cloud does provide. I mentioned a bit about, again, supporting the remote and distributed workforces. Obviously, that became very relevant during the COVID years. We're now supporting, folks all over the country and potentially worldwide to be able to securely access, right? And so that's where that continuous authorization, that continuous validation comes into play. And again, from a capability perspective, and we're going to talk more about those individual capabilities, but it does enable the modern security and monitoring capabilities that weren't traditionally available for kind of like the legacy on-prem data center approach. It also aligns with federal guidance and funding incentives. A lot of the federal guidance that's coming out now is really pushing towards cloud adoption. We're even starting to see more of the AI adoption, things like that. So it does help from a having that holistic view of your spend and how the budget is being utilized. So then you're continuously justifying your cybersecurity budgets and or AWS spend. And lastly, it really makes shared services and the cross-agency collaboration possible. So again, this goes back to that whole estate approach, allowing for integrations, data sharing, all of those things possible. But we need to take into consideration again how that data is classified, how is it secured, encrypted, things of that nature. And really, to wrap up our overall thought, cloud is not about modernization for its own sake. It's really about mission resilience, right? So we're using the technology, we're using the capabilities that are at our disposal, but we need to tie it back to a mission resilience mindset. So over the years, we've identified a lot of common pitfalls, and so we wanted to kind of cross-reference that with the best practices. So starting with network-centric security, again, this goes back to kind of that perimeter security approach where you have implicit trust if you're within that VPC versus taking that identity first and contextually aware approach where we're continuously evaluating the authorization of the identity and the device, and understanding what they're able to access, and doing that on a per connection basis. Static credentials and IAM sprawl, again, that is going to drive your attack surface. So if you don't have a good handle on the credentials and permissions that give access to services in the cloud, that's going to lead to some bad outcomes, right? So kind of shifting that into a short-lived credentials tied to RBAC approach is going to be paramount to ensuring the security of the environment. Flat VPCs and implicit trust I just kind of talked about, and we're going to get into some of the zero trust microsegmentation approaches that allow us to then carve up the network in a logical way, and via things like software defined networking and other strategies to ensure that we're locking things down appropriately, and preventing breaches. Tool sprawl without outcomes. Again, like I mentioned before, the technology and capabilities continues to grow. And if you don't have an overarching strategy and thinking in terms of risk-driven security architecture, what you end up with is a lot of silos of different technologies that may have overlap. And then you find yourself kind of going through the exercise of doing tool justification and cybersecurity tool justification because you have duplicates that you're spending money on. Right. So it's very important to take that risk-driven, kind of top-down approach to building out the architecture and understanding the capabilities that you need to meet the mission. Shadow IT and AI and SaaS risk, again, with the ease of deployment that cloud provides, if you don't have a model that ensures capture, inventory, and security baselines are in place, you're inevitably going to have things that you don't expect popping up, whether it's an EC2 instance that wasn't built on a gold image that has the security in place, or an S3 bucket that maybe is exposed to the public internet, right? So there are ways, right, that we can drive a visibility for SaaS and AI governance approach, which we're going to touch on in more detail here in a minute. Another big one is not understanding your attack surface. So like I'd mentioned previously, using cloud and getting the scalability and the ease of deployment capabilities from cloud. If you're not able to measure your attack surface, then you're not going to understand how quickly it can change. So really shifting that into a continuous attack surface awareness and utilizing the appropriate tooling to give you that visibility and to make those risk decisions on a day by day, hour by hour basis. And lastly is taking a compliance first instead of a risk first approach. Again, what we've seen to be very successful is taking more of an informed, risk informed approach that is compliance aligned. So again, that goes back to understanding your threat profile. What is your attack surface? What are the potential APTs that might be targeting your organization based on the business context? And let's make sure that we have the right tools and approaches in place to protect against those things. And then lastly, what happens if we don't address these things? If we don't have that plan, right? I think these are pretty self-explanatory, but in terms of increased likelihood for breaches and ransomware, data loss, and also the overall ability to understand the blast radius, not only from misconfigurations but from successful exploits. Again, this goes back to assuming breach, and when we talk about resilience, it's really about if a breach happens, which you assume it will, what are the policies, the SOPs, and the governance model in place that allows us to rapidly respond to those and to be able to get the situation under control, and then be able to do post-mortem analysis to understand what went wrong, how did they get in, and how do we plug that gap, right? Slower incident detection and response. Again, your SOC team is really beholden to the telemetry and the tooling that they have in place. So if these things are taken into consideration up front, they're really not going to have the ability to rapidly detect and respond to these risks. Rising operational and security costs. So I think we're all familiar with tech debt. So again, if you kind of ingrain bad practices or legacy approaches, that tech debt builds up. But there's also risk debt, right? And there's also threat awareness debt, right? So these things all come due at some point in the future. So getting ahead of these things is paramount. From an audit findings and compliance failures perspective, again, if you're treating audits as when they're due, or once a year, or maybe during the initial ATO process, again, you're leaving yourself exposed over the long term. And our goal is to help drive the continuous kind of ATO approaches that allow you to know at any second, what is your current compliance status for the system, right? And having that visibility. And like we talked about before, successful breaches, data loss, things like that, even the legal ramifications, it really erodes public trust and confidence in the organization if you're not taking these things into consideration up front. And then lastly is, if you're not attacking these things, right, you start to build in doubt and skepticism towards future modernization, which is going to leave you behind in terms of being able to adopt the latest technologies and capabilities, right? So we want to address that up front, so that way we're building confidence in terms of modernization efforts, which may come into cloud migrations or cloud modernization type efforts. And now we're going to talk really quickly just about our foundational cybersecurity approach. Again, we feel that all downstream activities, whether it's cloud security or cloud tooling, really ties back to this foundational cybersecurity approach that we utilize with our customers. First and foremost, in terms of establishing the foundation, is defining your cybersecurity concept of operations. This document is very, very important in terms of how technology is going to be built, operated, maintained, and even decommissioned over time. And so what we put together here is it's a bit of a journey, right? So each of these core components of the cyber ConOps lead into the next section, right? And it all starts with understanding mission and business context. So if you have a good handle on that, that is going to then influence, okay, now that we understand what our mission is, what our high value assets, what is our critical infrastructure, then we can start to define, well, what is the threat environment that we're operating in? What are the types of attacks that we need to expect in terms of making risk assumptions? And then as you define that, that leads into, defining your security objectives. What is the risk acceptance, appetite? Because again, some missions may require some risk acceptance depending on the business context, whereas others are non-negotiable, right? So again, as you move through this, then you're defining your operating model and the governance model that'll then govern all of the additional, downstream items in terms of building your architecture. What are the security capabilities and services that we need to have in place? The operational execution, all the way through to finally metrics, maturity, and continuous improvement. Because again, this is not a one and done thing. And so again, the cyber ConOps really anchors the security mission, the security program to mission outcomes. And again, it should not be technology specific. It should be agnostic and more focused on that governance and operating model. And this should be a living document, right? That's updated and routinely reviewed, because as new technology comes out, again, that's going to shift your threat profile. It's going to shift your attack surface. And again, we've seen this approach be proven time and time again in terms of whole estate approaches. So how can all state agencies within a certain state or even across states be able to share that same foundational element in terms of how to operate their security programs and adopt cloud safely. So again, we've seen this proven time and time again to be very, very successful. And then the way we like to look at this is more of a cyber resilience maturity model. So this is our view in terms of how, and you may look at this and you can kind of determine where you're at in terms of the different levels. But moving from left to right, we kind of begin with the rationalized approach, right? We're saying, hey, you have your aligned business requirements. We understand who the stakeholders are. We want to have a simplified and streamlined architecture, and we're defining those success metrics. And then below that, we're layering in the different resilience capabilities that help support those top level objectives based on the level of the maturity model, right? And so as we move through, going from left to right, you start to see where we're layering in additional capabilities. We're increasing the expectations in terms of objectives for the security program. And that's where we're leading towards, full ZTA, full zero trust architecture tooling implementation. We want to get in terms of the long run, automated threat intelligence contextualization, end-to-end policy automation, things like that. And it's all underpinned by the industry recognized NIST frameworks, right? So depending on your environment, there's going to be different requirements in terms of those frameworks, but it's all grounded in the NIST CSF, building off of 853 in terms of our baseline policy, and then layering in the more specific compliance policies as we move through this. And with that, Mike, did you have anything you wanted to add in terms of the maturity model before we shift into secure cloud?
No, I don't think so. Again, I think we'll hit this a little bit more. I mean, the only thing that I would add to it is that foundationally, as we go through this, the rationalization phase ends up being one of the most important tied to future decision making. So again, the way that you align business requirements tied to the ability to be adaptive within the different ecosystems, and as that moves into a cloud architecture, is really going to be the foundational element that you'll see as we move forward in this presentation.
And then lastly, just one point before we shift into the secure cloud sections. This is where once we have all that defined, right, where we can start to look at tying the technology to the individual mission, right? And there's a lot of products out there, and there's no one way to get there, right? And I think that's the big emphasis here in terms of the zero trust pillars. What are the types of tools and vendors that we need to be engaged with? But taking into consideration, again, the budgetary constraints, the mission objective, and the way we look at this is it's not just point solutions kind of playing whack-a-mole in terms of filling gaps. We try to take a holistic approach in terms of what does the integration and orchestration across the tools, how is that going to be orchestrated and set up for success? Because again, when we're talking about resilience and assuming a breach, we need that cross-pollination, that integration across the tools in order to successfully get ahead of a breach, put things, or basically shut down insecure access, things of that nature. So again, there's a lot of different tools out there. There's a lot of different ways to achieve those mission outcomes. And we're going to talk a little bit more here in a minute just about how those integrations would work. And with that, I'll toss it over to Mike.
Yeah, so let's hop into the actual meat of the presentation from a secure cloud approach side. So, some of the key principles that we have overall are around some of the things we talked about previously, where we have an identity-centric, no implicit trust approach to the way that organizations are built, right? So ensuring that each user, device, workload, et cetera, has authentication, is authorized, and is continuously done so from a least privilege and access governance perspective. Tying in continuous verification and risk-based access to limit the overall, again, we mentioned blast radius earlier, but what is the way that we can architect systems to ensure that if something bad does happen, which inevitably in every single circumstance, something bad does happen, right? How do we limit that issue? And then how do we ensure that we're providing the fastest mean time to resolution for whatever that particular issue is. And that ties to that secure by design cloud architecture, as well as how we build visibility into that. Slide. So, we just showed you that previous maturity model as a part of it. This is what we look at as our cloud maturity model, right? And it differs a little bit. The previous one is built upon the concept of NIST CSF and some of the foundational aspects of rationalization and integration and governance and so on. This one is really around how operationally can we put forward a mature model that is measurable with objective outcomes and so on. So it standardizes around 5 different levels and layers, right? So one is the foundational aspect where we're establishing the capabilities. The second one is structured, where we're looking at enhancements to that, but ensuring that it's a repeatable framework as a part of it. Then you get into integrated with all the nuance that's there in terms of advanced data protections and the way that that integrated framework works as a part of an actual ecosystem. And then you move into adaptive and then eventually autonomous. And we hit each one of these. The meat of this presentation, if you go to the next slide, is really around these 5 things, right? And so as you're designing and building this level up or maturation process for your overall cloud environment, as long as you can have the establishment of basic controls, the connected governance, the standardized identity logging and baseline completions, the continuous assessment of risk, and then tying that eventually into autonomous, which is, again, you'll come to find as we get to that slide, is not fully autonomous as a part of it. There's minimal human interaction as a part of it. But your idea, again, from a blast radius perspective, is to ensure that we're able to quickly and efficiently be able to stop bad from happening while also scaling good in terms of the operational context of the environment, right? So next slide. So this is the one we'll probably spend the most time on. Again, this is meant to give anybody on the line a look at, like, this is the foundational governance model that we have deployed to hundreds and hundreds of thousands of different assets across multiplicative hundreds and hundreds of state level customers as well as federal level customers as a part of it. So I'll orient you to the top left of the governance box. And so really looking at law, statutes, and regulations and standards and policies, both in internal and external, and those controls, and both from a physical and technical perspective. The difference between IRS safeguards data versus CJIS data, while they have overlap in terms of the way the controls are applied, there are differences in the way that you have storage for timing, the amount of data that you're supposed to bring in, the types of data that you're supposed to bring in, the controls that you put around them. Ensuring that you have a mapping of that and that you're easily able to continuously verify that those particular controls are met in a technical fashion becomes a difficult thing, especially in a multi-tenant and multi-cloud environment, as well as even with a single cloud environment. So to do that, establishing those baseline metrics of this is what good looks like from a continuous compliance perspective and authorization side, which is oriented in the middle, becomes extremely important. What is that governance structure that is going to be used to objectively say that you're doing well on that? And then underpinning that with the DevSecOps or continuous baseline deployment of that. So it's a fancy word. There's a lot of things about DevSecOps that are great. But at the end of the day, from a DevSecOps perspective, it's how do I quickly orient around mission objectives, use automation pipelines, dynamic testing, static testing, immutable workloads to quickly deploy and build compliant infrastructures that allow for me to meet my governance standards in a way that is scaled and tailored to that governance structure, right? So this approach is what we use as the foundational element. So as we're building in all of that business aware context, et cetera, we're going to use these things. And then the outputs of that are things like OSCO libraries and so on that allow for us to continuously assess the evaluation of that. And within whatever authorization to operate guideline that particular state uses, whether it's the true NIST 853 or if it's something else that's tied to it, you're able to sit there and say, authorizing officials understand the risk of each of the different organizational elements tied to the cloud environment and tied to hybrid environments as well, to provide basic control governance and visibility to operate that cloud in a safe manner that is meaningful to everybody who uses that, as well as the constituents that are inheriting those services as a part of it. Next slide. So then, what does that mean from a structure perspective, right? So I talk about level 2 with the connected governance, authorization, and delivery through repeated security workflows. I talked a little bit about the DevSecOps pipeline, but realistically speaking, providing things like service control policies, building things that would allow for individual cloud environments to take advantage of cloud native services, as well as the deployment of immutable architectures and immutable workloads, infrastructure as code and compliance as code, allows for us to have a structured approach that is enforced throughout. So the policy-driven governance, as well as the continuous enforcement, using these automation pipelines, using the real-time authorization aspects, because you've already defined as part of your original foundational elements, the EGRC components of this, I can understand that this particular system or systems or infrastructure should be allowed to deploy because of the closed loop assurance with, again, gold images, immutable infrastructure, immutable workloads, and so on as a part of that. So this is where you really enforce the standardization of deployment and then ensure that it ties into that EGRC component as a part of it. Next slide. So in practice, right, this is just a sample architecture for one of the customers that we have. And again, there's a little bit of nuance here, but you look at it as multiple different layers. So your identity layer on the far right side, where you have Active Directory or integration layers tied to things like Okta or Ping or Entra or otherwise, whatever the service is, doesn't really matter. The idea is that you're using ID proofing as the primary mechanism to go say, I am implicitly this person. However, I'm going to verify that via the policy enforcement points and the policy brokers, right, as a part of the overall integration for access to different layers. So using a zero trust security layer as a thing that uses identity and other aspects of that to do attribute-based access controls and otherwise, which allows for access, if you orient you to the left-hand side of the screen, to individual VPCs, to individual VNets, depending upon if you're using AWS or Azure or otherwise, and using that to allow for us to access the appropriate data types with those policy enforcement points as a part of it. Again, most organizations aren't just going to be a cloud-only organization. They're going to be hybridized in some manner. They're going to have assets and managed assets, users that are accessing that as well. So how do I tie all of that together into a device compliance and a zero trust approach for that particular cloud environment that's been deployed using my DevSecOps pipeline with the governance framework that's been put in place, and then continuously look at that from a data analytic perspective, evaluation, security operations, and unify that visibility across the stack with policy-driven standardization and normalized identity and device context. Again, and I go back to the very first level that we talked about with the foundational elements of this. And again, that's where I sit there and say, well, since we've defined what the particular parameters are from an access control perspective, and now we have the tooling that's behind that, whether cloud native or otherwise, we now have the ability to understand, hey, there needs to be a 15-minute logout timing. There needs to be some type of attribute that allows for me to access the downstream VPCs that are necessary. This tooling has to have some level of additional multi-factor authentication and so on. It gives you a repeatable process and an enforcement mechanism to be able to provide that. Next slide. So then we talk about adapting those particular things, and adapting and adaptive in general from a level perspective is really about continuously assessing risk and enforcing that policy in near real time, right? So around this, you have your zero trust pillars around network security and identity and device security and so on. But at the fundamental middle of this, right, and using the governance structure and so on, we have CNAPP and cloud, right? So the cloud itself, using things like cloud security posture management or infrastructure entitlement management or workload protection or Kubernetes security posture management. There's tons of items, as John mentioned at the beginning, over 150 of them in these individual cloud areas and environments that you need to make use of in terms of zero trust standards applied to governance and ensure that you understand what the risk is of each of them. So from a CSPM perspective, I want to be able to look at what my indicators of misconfiguration within my standard environment is. Well, I can do that using, Security Hub, or I can do that using, name your platform as a part of the CSPM profile and automatically start to adapt the changes to that back into my DevSecOps pipeline, back to the structured side to fix that in the future. So if I deploy an insecure EC2 instance, or I deploy an insecure bucket of some kind, or I deploy some ephemeral asset such as a Lambda or otherwise, I now understand that I can fix that within the deployment mechanism to bring it all the way back to that governance structure to do it securely, repeatably, and ensuring that we're sustaining that continuous monitoring aspect of what we're doing and tying that back to the authorization for that thing to operate in the first place. And again, this works well, and we've seen it work well across Siege's title, title data, the FTI data and otherwise in terms of that governance structure, because you're building the controls based upon those frameworks as a part of it. And then for level 5, I would say that this is sort of the okay, great. So now that you've done the key things that are necessary in terms of structure and integrations and identity and all of this in terms of zero trust, like what does that look like? So at the very top, it looks like security intent and governance, right? It looks like policy as code and how that gets pushed. It looks like risk tolerance and what that looks like from an objective perspective based upon whatever state agency or group is using, whatever the regulatory requirements are a part of it, and then using that for continuous signal ingestion as a part of it. So you could use signal and telemetry here interchangeably, but that autonomous detection engine that takes that real-time content, builds the continuous evaluations as part of the policy enforcement, and makes policy decisions based upon that for access controls, quarantines, rollbacks and recovery, auto remediation, and so on. So again, tying all of that together into a cloud and DevSecOps environment, which again does not just say just cloud. Like cloud is the impetus of this particular conversation, but there is a tie-in with SaaS as well as on-prem apps and so on. There's a number of different financial institutions that are still running on mainframe. How do I tie in my decision-making paradigm to a traditional on-prem infrastructure? What does that look like with the modernization aspect of it? And how do I do things like look at runtime and ensure that a particular asset is fixed, understood, and otherwise? And the answer to this is predicting, preventing, and responding to those threats with minimal, not no, but minimal human intervention. And if I orient you to the human in the loop oversight there, that's really how we're looking at it, right? We have individuals that tie to pipeline management that allow for us to be able to say, this is something that is good to deploy or not good to deploy, with recommendations that overlay things like artificial intelligence, that overlay LLMs, that overlay traditional and non-traditional cloud deployments, et cetera. And that automation that we use and the optimization for that cloud native environment comes out of just using this consistently and then feeding those individual things back. So from a strategic level where you set your foundational elements all the way down to we're automating and enforcing these actions across the environment at scale is where we really see the value of this particular approach and what we've done previously. Next slide. So I think that, it's great to talk about things in context. It's great to, really have that conversation, but it's more important to really talk about this with concrete customer stories as a part of it. So I'll give one and then we'll kind of hit a couple ancillary ones. So one of the clients that we have and we have a very good relationship with is a group called Events TC. They are a pseudo SLED agency that's based out of the District of Columbia. They have about 1.24 million individual folks that come there a year. They host everything from the new RFK Stadium grounds to the Washington Convention Center, right? And so from a background perspective, we were brought in 2022 due to a crippling ransomware attack that shut down the totality of the operations of that group, right? And this is one of the big earners as a part of the DC area in terms of, a governmental agency within there. So what did we do, right? Well, we started from the concept of operations perspective, and we built out, a number of solutions, et cetera, as well as understanding exactly how to get them back up and running, what that looks like. And then this is what it turned into. So from a security and cloud operations perspective, everything from a managed services program and security engineering and security operations themselves that would allow for continuous incident response and so on in a way that was both cost effective as well as scaled to the necessary cloud infrastructure, et cetera, that they have. And that included as well taking them from I want to modernize to the cloud to moving their on-prem environment to a cloud and Azure focused environment that allowed for cloud native security tenants, ZTNA overlays for zero trust architecture, and the objective metrics that were necessary to say this is what good looks like there. Included in that, these are us saying, hey, here's the selections of the different, tooling, et cetera, that we use in this particular circumstance. So on top of using some of the native functions of that, using Cribble for streamlined telemetry delivery, using CrowdStrike for EDR and next-gen SIEM as a part of the overall ecosystem, as well as the identity threat, right? Back to identity being a core concept of what we're looking at. Using Zscaler for all of the zero trust, ZPA, ZIA aspects of access and data loss prevention. Using Palo from a perimeter perspective, providing that from an executive perspective that allows for us to say, here's objectively how we're supporting you and being there with you day in and out. And then, last but not least, from a Tanium side, making sure that we can deploy to multi-thousand endpoint cloud environments as well as on-prem environments quickly and efficiently so that we can provision that equipment, that we can use that DevSecOps framework that we established as a part of the overall cloud operations and ensure that we are having distinct outcomes that help them, which led to successful audits just the year after and what that looked like in terms of all the different things they had to look at for them hosting the NATO conference, multiple sessions and different vendors and so on. But this is the distinct thing where there's multiple videos online right now where you can see the success story for a medium-sized, state and local entity, right? As well as all of the things that can be done as you sit there and say, I'm going to establish that foundational structure with what we move forward with. Next. So recommendations and resources. I think about that example, and I think that oftentimes we get a bit over our skis and we say, look at all these new things. Foundationally speaking, frameworks are the best, right? I work on this concept of more than zero security, making sure that we're using the frameworks that are built and then adapting them for individual organizations. So in this presentation, we've given a number of different links, etc., whether it be the NIST zero trust tool mappings. I would highly recommend, even if you don't have access to the slide, going and searching that. There is a distinct zero trust tool mapping that is available via NIST that will show you how you're going to meet, whether it be CSF1, 2, RMF, whatever the control sets are. It'll talk about it from an AWS perspective. It'll talk about it from Azure, and different tooling is a part of that. The OAuth cheat sheet series, which allows for you to understand cybersecurity mappings, et cetera, tied to resilient architectures. Multiple zero trust reference architectures too, and then really getting into that secure cloud reference architecture as a part of this. So these are things that you can go research that you don't necessarily have to reach out to start to establish what you believe the bespoke principles of trustworthy and secure systems are on your behalf, and something that you can build into that concept of operations for your cloud modernization. Next. In the case that is something that you want to reach out to us on, here is our contact info. You can reach us at info@truezerotech.com or at truezerotech.com itself. From a services perspective, here's where we are and the contract vehicles that we're a part of. Inclusive of this is also IT70 as a part of it too. But in case you want an understanding or just to have a conversation about it, we are more than open. Our goal with this, and we shared quite a bit in terms of architecturally how we do things, how we go after items, how we actually build this as part of our overall ecosystem. I wanted to do that, and John wanted to do that because of the fact that it's important to us that state agencies, especially with the 25 plus, as well as the ones that we're not in, are safe. We have many, many different missions, whether it be on a given day that we're working with the Department of Public Safety and a highway patrolman, or if we're working with Health and Human Services native to an individual state organization. We want them to be taken care of. We want them to ensure that they have secure principles as a part of that, because we have a remote by design company that has employees across the US, right? And that really resonates with us in terms of our overall your target, our mission tagline and what we do. So next slide. So before we hit the Q&A, one thing I did want to hit is around the size, scope, and complexity tied to this. So we talked about whole estate, and we talked about this in terms of endpoints and thousands of endpoints from the customer story perspective. I do think that there is, that it says, okay, great, it's a couple thousand endpoints here or there. We've scaled this, and it does scale to hundreds of thousands of endpoints for a given customer at any given time, right? So when we give one example as a part of that, noting that we've done this type of SIEM enablement, CIEM as a part of the infrastructure enablement, or this cloud and CNAPP integration and build as a part of it, it does scale, it does work, and it has allowed for them to continue to modernize and be some of the leading thought leaders as part of things like NASIO, things like the ability for the individual states to be protected and so on. So we're really excited about that. We hope that this was helpful. And I think at this point, we'll open it up for any Q&A that might be out there.
Jim, did you want to look at the chat? Did we have any questions, or Jernana?
Don't see any in the chat, sir.
Cool. Sounds good. So I had a couple pre-prepared just in case that wasn't the case. So one of the primary ones that we often get is around does the approach scale? We talked about that. Does it require replacing existing tools and platforms? Right. Well, the answer is yes and no. Right. So as you define your approach and what that looks like, understanding what your tooling looks like matters, but what matters more is what process you want to implement overall as a part of the overall architecture and how that will look from an overall continuity side, right? So ensuring you have what's necessary, and if you don't, doing the gap analysis and capability assessment as a part of that, right? Not just having this be a go buy tools because tools are cool, that they are, we're technologists, we enjoy that. But at the end of the day, what you need to do is do the right investments, make sure that the right things are justified, whether it be via legislator, whether it be via overall spend investments that have been allocated previously, and so on, to ensure that you're getting the outcomes based upon those foundational elements we talked about. One of the other items that we often get is how do you balance continuous authorization and continuous monitoring as a part of the overall approach? And especially when you have limited tools, budget, and individuals, right? And again, this is where I go back to I fundamentally, and John fundamentally, believe in this more than zero security approach, right? We want you to continue to move forward in a way that protects data because data is the key here, right? Data is the impetus of everything. It's what we're working, it's what we as cyber individuals and cloud security individuals are employed for, right? It's to protect the data of any given system because information is power and king within the particular organization. So do the things that are necessary, obviously meeting the governance guidelines based upon other agencies, et cetera, and internal agency requirements. But just because you have a limited staff and a limited budget doesn't mean that you can't make appropriate investments to have the most bang for the buck. If you have limited staff and limited budget, focus down on things like patch management. Build the house, build the frame of the house. Don't worry about all the fun things that you want to have inside of it. Make sure that you're building this in a way that allows for you to architecturally and scale, right? So patch management, things like identity is my Active Directory. There's plenty of free tools. You can go grab Bloodhound offline and ensure that you look at your LDAP and validate that you don't have over permissioning as a part of it. There's a lot of different things that can be done there. Not the last one, but how does this support hybrid environments? Again, I've stated a few different times as a part of this that hybridized environments are going to be one of the most common aspects of this. So as you modernize to the cloud and you use the pipelines as a part of the overall ecosystem to do those deployments, you're still going to have your users that have laptops. You're still going to have, even the virtual desktop aspect of it where you have potentially disconnected areas as a part of that. You're going to have IT IoT systems. You're going to have, other disconnected environments and physical environment systems and so on. Those things are still within the scope of this. So building this in a way that allows you to have that policy enforcement point for the cloud and also getting the telemetry tied to each of those different environments to then put it forward in a continuous and threat-centric approach is really where you need to spend the time and validate that. And again, all comes back to those foundational elements as a part of it. And I guess the very, very last thing I'll say is what does meaningful progress look like within 90 days, right? So there's a lot of stuff that we talked about, a lot of different elements, not sure where to start. Meaningful progress is having a plan established and what that's going to look like for your individual organization. Back to the people and process and technology aspect of things and, oh, do we have budget? Do we not have budget? As long as you are setting the plan and moving towards that at the pace that is specific for your organization, whether it's small, medium, or large, my argument would be that you're moving the ball forward. And as long as you're working that with urgency, et cetera, and you're setting the goals and the timing that aligns with funding cycles, that aligns with your overall mission objectives and needs, that is what positive progress looks like. Do not be discouraged by we're not at level 3 or level 4 right now. That's okay. Like, how can you start to move towards that and organizationally metric and objectively metric the way that value is provided and be able to do that to senior leaders, yourselves, and otherwise. So with that, I'll pause. Any other questions? Otherwise, we'll hand it back. Thank you all for the time. Appreciate it.
Yes. Thank you, Jonathan and Mike. I'd like to also thank our participants for joining, as well as our speakers for presenting and answering questions today. We hope our webinar has been helpful to you and your organization.